Welcome to another of the Centre for Economic Policy Research's video podcasts on the fast-moving impact of COVID-19. My name is Tim Phillips. For many years, Warwick McKibbin of the Australian National University has deployed a class of economic models that he pioneered to analyse the impacts of global shocks. He was one of the authors of a chapter in our first ebook on the crisis that, where many politicians were still dismissing COVID-19's importance, predicted the potential for hundreds of thousands of deaths and large falls in GDP. So how have subsequent effects influenced his estimates? Let's find out. Warwick, welcome.
Great to be here, Tim.
The class of models you used was, I think, originally created for processes like climate change. Can you explain how the model works?
Yeah, the model itself is actually a merging of two different models. The original model was my work with Jeffrey Sachs from Harvard in my PhD thesis, looking at cooperation across countries in macroeconomic policy. And we merged that model with the Jorgensen, Wilcox, and very disaggregated sectoral models of the US to create a model of the world which has clear macroeconomics. It has a lot of disaggregation. So we model individual firms within sectors and households. And the idea was to try and encompass the world to analyze very complex questions with a very simple model compared to reality, but a very complex model compared to what's in the literature.
And it has elements of DSGE modelling, but it isn't a DSGE model, is it?
Well, one could argue that it is the first DSGE model that was built. Well, the one I built with Jeffrey Sachs back in the mid-'80s was actually one of the very early dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. It's just that we built it on the east coast of the US instead of in the at Minnesota or Chicago. So we never actually were acknowledged by that literature, but in fact, it's in that spirit of agents, households and firms optimizing and looking forward, and expectations are important, but they're not all rational. So it has a lot of characteristics. In fact, it's a hybrid between a DSGE model and a computable general equilibrium model, CGE type model.
I see from the literature that in the past you have used it to model the impact of epidemics, pandemics before, SARS, influenza.
That's right. In fact, in 2003, we were approached by the World Health Organization to give an estimate of what we thought it would cost when the SARS pandemic emerged. And Professor Zhonghua Li from Korea University and I sat down for a day and worked out how would you actually model something like a SARS pandemic. And we were very early on putting the research at international conferences and published it. And in the end, that was the official estimate of the World Health Organization of the cost of SARS, which was $40 billion US dollars. We subsequently used it again, interacting with the WHO as well as various policymakers in different countries, looking at H5N1, bird flu, swine flu. I mean, there's a pandemic somewhere potentially every year. Unfortunately, when it was occurring in countries that people didn't really care about. It's when it crosses into advanced economies that people take notice. And so our goal was to find out, or to make the argument that the cost of a pandemic was so great that you should be willing to spend quite a lot of money to invest in the public health systems of countries where these pandemics tend to emerge. And so that was the goal of what we were doing.
So talking about the country coverage, how much of the world economy does your model cover now?
Well, it does cover the entire world, and we break it down into different regions. So the work on climate change, we have 10 main regions, and the regions are the key players, the top emitters in the world, but the entire world is in the model. We've just finished a big study on demographic change, and there we have the world broken down into 20 regions. We've done a study on the G20 where we have 24 regions. For the pandemic model, we're using the G20 model. So we have 24 different regions of the world encompassing all countries.
I note in your original estimates that were in the chapter that we published, several of your scenarios assumed that COVID-19 would not spread outside China. Now, this implies to me that you were already working on your predictions at the very, very early stages of this pandemic. What sounded the alarm to you? What made you think that this was really something that you should be giving your attention to?
Well, actually, we were at the very final stages of a major report looking at antimicrobial resistant diseases. These are the diseases that we see proliferating all over the world, the resistance to penicillin. The fact that in Africa, 80% of tuberculosis is untreatable because it's resistant now to penicillins and other treatments. So we were modelling this long-term issue, which I think is really important. And we had everything in place, including a newly arrived PhD student, Roshan Fernando, to work on this topic with me. And we started to read about what's happening in China. We actually started the project very early January. And then we decided it was really useful to gear up. And by the time we got to late January, early February, we were ready to start running the results. And then we actually had the first draft in the middle of February. And then we put it out at Brookings and the ANU simultaneously around the beginning of March. We actually circulated it to policymakers well before that, I should mention. A lot of people were given advance notice of what was there because the numbers were fairly large and we were concerned about what the impact might be, and we didn't want any surprises. So we had briefings of the IMF, the World Bank and the Fed. People from Bank of England, Bank of Japan, Reserve Bank, Australian Treasury had all been pre-briefed on what was coming.
Yes, as you say, the numbers were quite large. They're numbers that we're getting used to now, but at the time were quite shocking. What assumptions about COVID-19 and the functioning of the world economy do you have to make to come out with those numbers?
So we weren't doing any forecasts. This was just the idea of scenarios. And the idea was, what have we seen in the past? And we said, well, we have the data on epidemiological outcomes in the Spanish flu, in the Asian flu and the Hong Kong flu. So we knew what sort of case infection rates were possible and what case mortality rates were possible. So we take those assumptions on the epidemiological side. And then we said, well, when we get these sorts of pandemics, what have we observed in history? How have countries reacted and what's happened to economies? So we had the SARS pandemic and we knew for a certain epidemiological outcome how much the economies were impacted. So then we broke down the shocks into a series of shocks on supply, on demand, on expectations, on people's perception of panic and fear. And we molded those shocks into some proportional change coming from the pandemics, epidemiological pandemic data. And so we were able to really just make it up in a sense, but we developed an enormous number of indicators because countries were very different. And we wanted to try and capture the countries that had weak health systems versus strong health systems, who had capacity to respond, who trusted governments, who didn't. And so we developed the shocks, amplified them up or down based on a whole range of indicators we're drawing from our earlier work on SARS and on bird flu.
In your the initial scenarios, the GDP impacts for Europe and the US, they were between 2% and 8% decline in GDP. With what we now know about the spread of COVID-19, can we narrow this down? Is there reason to revise that?
Well, it's interesting. We are revising this now. At the time we developed the methodology, it was really about an epicenter in China and how would it spread. So 3 of the scenarios were just China specific. 3 were, what if it becomes a pandemic? The 3 being Spanish flu, Hong Kong flu, and Asian flu. And the final scenario was, what if it's persistent now? People realize this is persistent. And so what we have now got information on is how many people have been infected. We're getting a good idea, but it's still not anywhere near over. But we're getting a good idea that there are really 3 different types of responses. We've had countries like Sweden that don't interfere, just let the pandemic run. We have countries that have been partially shutting down, and we have countries like Australia and other countries that have completely shut down. So we've got 3 different types of policy responses that you can scale the pandemic numbers with. And we also have really good information on how much economic damage has been done, because under SARS, countries didn't actually shut down. Under what we're seeing with COVID-19 is countries are completely closing down, or closing down large states or large sectors of the economy. So we can then use that to come up with new estimates. So what you see is we have very high pandemic outcomes in the scenarios compared to what we're seeing in a lot of countries. Maybe not compared to Italy and maybe not compared to Iran, but certainly Australia has very low numbers. But still economic costs have been very large because the policy interventions have been very, very different. So now we're trying to work out how to overlay the pandemics with the economic outcomes. And so if you look at our scenarios, we're well below scenario 4 in terms of lives lost or morbidity, people being sick. But actually, I think the economic costs look more like scenario 6, but even larger. So in scenario 6, we've got 6 to 8% of GDP, as you say. I'm thinking for some countries, we could be talking easily 10 to 15% of GDP. A lot is still uncertain, and a lot will depend on how the economies react to these unprecedented fiscal and monetary responses in their country. So we're in a world that we haven't seen before. And that's why you think using models and using scenarios is a very helpful tool for thinking through what are the key pressure points, what are the key issues, how do we respond, and what if we don't respond? And so we've got some really interesting experiments out there, unfortunately, with people's lives on the line.
Can you tell me a little bit more about this seventh scenario? The first six, as you say, the first three were China only. The second three were spread outside China, but as a once-off pandemic. What is this seventh scenario with persistence, as you call it?
It's a good question, because what we assumed was pretty much a V shape for the fifth, fourth, fifth, and sixth scenario. So the pandemic hit this year. It hits again half as strong next year, but then it goes away, and so you get what looks like a V shape. The seventh scenario is, what if it actually looks like the fourth scenario? So it's not a very large pandemic, but it's serious and it continues year after year. So it's like a stochastic disturbance that keeps coming back. The responses to that are very, very different, because it changes the return on investment in certain sectors. It leads to big investment responses. It leads to a change in behaviour, which we were trying to model. But when you look at what's happening with COVID-19, the behavioural changes are likely to be enormous, even if the pandemic eventually goes away, just because of the size, the way people have responded, and the way governments have responded. It's a fascinating experiment in jolting the global economy and then trying to understand what comes after the jolt.
So roughly speaking, does that create an L-shaped depression in the global economy? Does that mean that the recovery just never happens?
No, it does. So in the first year, you still get the V, but the rebound is not anywhere near as large, and you have a long-term persistent reduction in growth. Now, again, you could do another scenario, which I'm toying with the idea is, suppose what's happened, and we've just published a big paper on productivity growth scenarios through Brookings, looking at singularity, where technology creates productivity. What if the transformation we've seen in the way we do business, the way we interact with each other, the way we teach, what if those innovations, all that technology that was sitting around not being used is now used? And we do end up after several years with this very large productivity enhanced jolt to the world economy in the opposite direction. And that's also a plausible scenario, and a very interesting one.
Your model and some others like it, optimally, they act as a guide to policymakers to take early action. And as you say, you had a lot of communication with policymakers at an early stage. Is it then disappointing when you do model these global shocks well, and you still see inaction and delay in policy making, maybe for political reasons?
Well, it's frustrating, but having worked extensively in the area of climate change, the fact that many politicians ignore science and ignore scientific methodology doesn't surprise me at all. What you have to keep doing is explaining and showing that your research is actually related to what you're observing around yourself. Now, the UK is a classic example. Why would you try the herd approach for a week and expose the entire economy to a devastating shock that the epidemiologists will tell you was a very bad idea? And so that to me, that's a surprise that some countries which you would, the UK education system produced some amazing scientists, and they bring knowledge to the world, but obviously not to the UK government. That disappoints me. The US doesn't surprise me. Australia apparently looks like they've been doing the right thing. But there's a lot of interesting experiments out there.
Thanks, Warwick. That's very interesting. And for all of you viewers who are following the science, please do keep in touch with our COVID-19 coverage at Vox EU. We're adding to it every day with articles, podcasts, videos like this one, and webinars. And if you specifically want to find out more about this model, then read chapter 3 in Economics in the Time of COVID-19, which is our free ebook. We published it a month ago. And the chapter is called The Economic Impact of COVID-19, and it's by Warwick McKibbin and Roshan Fernando. And that chapter was based on the working paper, The Global Macroeconomic Impacts of COVID-19, 7 Scenarios, same authors. Warwick, thank you very much and stay safe.
Thank you very much, Tim. The same to you. Great being on the show.
And the same goes to all the rest of you too. And so from the CEPR, goodbye for now.